So hello everyone, this is Dr. Shona Nag from Sahyadri Hospital, Pune, and I'll be giving you a little brief, an outline about the necessary investigations and approach to a patient with a breast lump before definitive treatment. So when we're looking at breast cancer, we all know the algorithm: optimal therapy, a consultation, a history, preoperative workup, clinical examination and imaging, which is paramount, other pre-op investigations, pathology. We'll briefly touch upon molecular subtypes, profiling assays, the staging, the grading system, and how treatment planning is done. So, as you all know, the treatment for this disease is multidisciplinary, as it is for most cancers, and the service model, which is preferred by women, provides continuity of care, uses a team approach, has psychosocial support, and ensures that the women get access to relevant health professionals at one location, and emphasizes liaison with community support such as GPs and nurses. So the diagnostic process is complex, and we usually look at the patient who first comes in with a health problem. The patient then engages with healthcare professionals and the health system. A history and examination is done. After that, consultation and referral and diagnostic testing is required. And once you have a working diagnosis, communication is very important to the patient, the treatment options, and finally the post-treatment administration. So this is the planned and preferred path of care based on the diagnosis that is made. When you think of consultation, it's usually the surgeon that is the first point of contact in the management of a woman with early operable breast cancer. And it's important to remember that surgery is just one modality, and it's important when you have a consultation even before the surgery that the surgeon brings up the concepts of radiotherapy, which may be required earlier, or chemotherapy or hormonal therapy. And this is very important because it primes the patient and prepares the patient. And any clinician who treats a woman with breast cancer should inform the patient on how to access these appropriate support services as well. So we all know it's a triple test that is done, and the first part includes a detailed history and thorough clinical examination. Then imaging occurs, which can be in the form of mammography and usually a complementary ultrasound, and this is followed by a tissue diagnosis. We prefer a core needle biopsy over FNA. The history is important because documentation, family history, comorbidities, past medical history and social history is very relevant. Menstrual history and obstetric are equally important, and a woman's social situation and a social history is important, which tells us what kind of stress she's going through, what is her affordability, what is her access to the different modalities of treatment we may be offering. And a thorough clinical examination should precede any other investigation. I had a lady the other day who'd come from the NHS, and she came with just telling me an abnormal mammogram has been found during her routine mammography, and she's been called back by the health system. Nobody bothered to examine her, and she had a 5 centimeter lump which was palpable in the left breast. So this is really, really important, and I can't underscore clinical exam. A knowledge of physical findings tell us about how we're going to sequence our investigations. It helps us to plan our therapeutic approaches, and it also helps us to raise awareness of any difficulties we might face potentially in the future. When you think of imaging, it's usually mammography, and especially in women over 40, and a complementary ultrasound or a sonography only in women less than 40. Digital mammo also is recommended, and it's very accurate. It has less radiation exposure, and of course an MRI in women with a very strong family history or carriers of BRCA1 and BRCA2. We may miss cancers on mammography, and these can be picked up by a targeted ultrasound. And the ACS, which is the American Society of Cancer, actually talks of doing mammographies routinely between beginning at 40, but there are other groups and other societies which disagree and say that screening should begin at 50. Nevertheless, it's important, and women who have access to screening must do so. Of course, it's not possible in the whole country, and therefore mammography has really not been taken up as a screening modality in countries like India. We know that DCIS is very nicely and easily picked up on mammography, and it may be associated with an invasive tumor. There are several types, like a native mammography without the use of contrast. Then you have galactography, where you have contrast injected into the milk ducts. Especially in cases with nipple discharge with a normal mammogram. You have MR mammography for patient with implants, and CT mammography. There are several BI-RAD categories which tell us about the risk of a cancer being present according to the BI-RAD staging, and we have category 1 and 2, which is usually normal. 3 needs to follow up, and patients with 4 and 5 definitely require a biopsy or further imaging and testing. If you look at the algorithm, it is pretty complex, and it is very nicely detailed here for a patient with abnormal mammograms, and it is pretty much what I said. If you look at the diagnosis and the algorithm of palpable breast abnormalities in women aged 30 and over, you can have patients with BI-RAD 1, 2 or 3, or as I mentioned earlier, 4 and 5, which definitely require some sort of further imaging and tissue diagnosis. What about contrast enhanced digital mammo? This has come up in a big way, and it relies on the function of tumor angiogenesis, and it's been used as an adjunct to mammography. It improves the sensitivity and performance, and also an improved accuracy as compared to mammography alone. Breast ultrasound, as I mentioned, is reliable, but it is a complementary method to mammography, especially in women with dense parenchyma, and especially in younger women, it is useful. Breast ultrasound is a supplement, and it is also useful in pregnant women who cannot have a mammography. Although it improves the sensitivity, the specificity is reduced, and you can have an increased rate of biopsy rates. It's important to remember that both normal and cancerous tissues can have acoustic properties which are similar, and not all cancers can be detected by mammography or ultrasound. So if you've got a persistent lump in a patient and both are normal, you may need an MRI or further investigation. And this is a diagnostic algorithm which is given for palpable breast abnormalities for women who are less than 40, and usually an ultrasound will let you differentiate between a solid cystic lesion and will tell you what the nature is and how to proceed further. And then of course you can have the mammography, which can be done in some of these women, and if malignant they have to be treated like a breast cancer. A PET scan is a little controversial in the sense when you get a patient with a locally advanced tumor, a large tumor size of more than 5 centimeters, or you get a palpable axilla, you may want to do further staging before taking the patient up for surgery or deciding the further course of treatment. And the NCCN guidelines usually recommend a CT chest and abdomen and a bone scan. In some centers, this becomes very cumbersome and perhaps more expensive. So a PET scan, which includes imaging of the entire body along with the bones, can be substituted for these investigations and is obviously an easier and single modality to do. Patients with inflammatory breast cancer must have some sort of staging, and a PET is preferred before initiation of neoadjuvant chemotherapy. An MRI helps in delineating indeterminate lesion. It's also used to find occult breast cancers who have an axillary mass. When you suspect multifocal, multicentric disease, bilateral disease, invasive lobular cancer, which also has a very high incidence of multifocality and centricity, you might want to do an MRI. You may also want to look for a response to neoadjuvant chemotherapy or a diagnosis or detection of a recurrence. In these cases, MRI is useful. There are certain contraindications. For example, you would not do it in a patient who's allergic to the contrast media, which is gadolinium based. You may have physical constraints, patients with spine abnormalities like kyphosis or marked obesity or very large breasts. Even patients who are claustrophobic will just not be suitable for an MRI. There is, this table very nicely shows the accuracy of the different modalities of breast imaging, and you can see that according to the sensitivity and specificity in the positive predictive value and the indications, mammography seems to score reasonably well, as does sonography. MRI has the highest sensitivity, but you can land up with a lot of false positives here. And as far as the PET goes, it's not really a very great modality for breast imaging. It's however good for looking for axillary nodes or for distant metastases. What about biopsy procedures, and what about finding the histology and confirming the diagnosis? So FNA used to be done and was a pretty easy way out, and it's simple to do, it's cost effective and cheap, but the accuracy is high, although in 10 to 15% of cases you may actually miss the tumor. And the accuracy can be improved by doing an FNA by a guided ultrasound. And as I mentioned, it has high sensitivity and specificity, and where there is no facility for processing tissue, and especially in rural areas, an FNA is acceptable. The problem is you need an expert cytologist to read the slide, and it's a good method to sample metastatic sites as well. And it gives the diagnosis very quickly vis-a-vis a core biopsy, which requires a block preparation and further staining, and a relief to a patient when there is a negative diagnosis. Unfortunately, FNAs cannot give you a receptor status, which is very important when you're planning neoadjuvant therapies. A core biopsy is the gold standard of care today, and this is usually performed on palpable lesions, sometimes even on smaller lesions under ultrasound guidance. And if the lesion is palpable, the core track has to be placed in such a way that you can enable surgical excision at the time of the surgery around the track. And both allow detailed discussion with the patient and may help you to do a one-stage surgical procedure. Core does score over FNA, and even though sensitivity, specificity, the positive and negative predictive values are comparable, we prefer today to do core needle biopsy as our standard procedures. And this is a very nice table showing you various studies in which FNA has been compared with core needle biopsies, and as you can see, they are quite comparable in all the 4 different criteria, but as I mentioned, core biopsy stands as the standard. Open biopsy is less desirable, but when you cannot obtain a cyto or a core biopsy is not giving you the results, then you may use an open biopsy, and it gives you detailed information, it gives you a lot of material, and it helps you to plan your treatment. Sometimes impalpable lesions may require needle localization, which is done under mammographic guidance usually, and this later is followed by an open surgical excision. Wherever possible, you must try and excise the small lesion completely when you are performing an open biopsy. And this is a breast biopsy algorithm which is very nicely given for solid lesions which are indeterminate or suspicious, and it actually tells you that when you do a core, You can figure out whether the lesion is benign or malignant or borderline, and especially in borderline lesions you may require further excision, and excision can also then help you figure out whether it's benign or malignant, or whether there is some atypia that is present. A frozen section is usually used nowadays, and we do it when we do breast conservative surgeries, and it is very important to delineate the margins, because you certainly do not want ink on the margins, and as in the case of DCIS, you may require a larger margin and you may need to go wider after the frozen section has told you that you're pretty close. So frozen section is a very useful thing to have in a center which is doing a lot of breast surgery. There are a whole lot of other preoperative investigations. This is not something that needs to be discussed in detail, but the anesthetist requires a certain amount of fitness, which is also given by the physician. So a full blood count, biochemistry, liver function tests, a chest x-ray, ultrasound of the abdomen, and of course cardiac fitness. Serological tests such as tumor markers, however, are not so important. When you are investigating the patient, it is important to look for bony pain and bony tenderness on a clinical exam, because this may indicate bone metastasis, in which case a curative surgery can be deferred and the patient can get on to radiation and systemic therapy straight away. So the key points to summarize are that all diagnostic modalities have an error rate, and it's advisable to use more than one modality to come to a preoperative diagnosis. It's a combination of a clinical exam, a mammography, and tissue diagnosis, either FNA or core biopsy, which gives you the lowest risk of diagnostic error, especially in women over 40. And you may, in some special cases, perform an open biopsy. What about pathology? Pathology is got three main aims. First, the diagnosis, then to ensure complete removal of the lesion, and thirdly, tumor markers or estrogen, progesterone, and HER2 receptors. So these are the things that we look at in a pathology report. We look at the tumor site, we look at the type, whether it is a mucinous or a papillary or invasive ductal or DCIS or medullary, etc. We look at the grade, we look at the margins, we look at multifocality, we look at extensive DCIS, we look at lymphovascular invasion, we look at the number of axillary nodes which have actually been removed with a minimum of 12 which is required and examined, we look at the presence of extracapsular spread, and finally estrogen receptor and HER2 status. So to assist the pathologist, the surgeon should send all the nodes. Usually a surgeon orientates the specimen, inks them properly so the pathologist knows exactly how to report the specimen and which quadrant of the breast that it has been removed from. In the case of a mastectomy, the situation is a little different, and clinicians always usually specify that they need IHC or immunohistochemistry receptor status in the form, and it's important to get both these, otherwise a lot of time gets wasted after the histopathology report comes out. And we also can look at other markers such as EGFR reception, the proliferative rate, the Ki-67 levels, although these are not used routinely for clinical decision making. So the surrogates which tell you about the type of breast cancer, the subtype that you're dealing with, are ER, PR, HER2, and sometimes we look, as I mentioned earlier, at the Ki-67 levels as well. Now, ER is a nuclear protein, it has nuclear staining, and it contributes a better prognosis. It tells you the response to hormonal therapy, and we think we call ER positive patients when they have a score of 1% or more. You have the Alred scoring, you have the H scoring. These are the commonly used systems for both ER and PR evaluation. PR is largely controlled by ER, but there are 5% of patients which are PR positive and ER negative. Earlier this was a lot more due to artifacts, but today when you get a PR positive, ER negative patients, you still give the benefit of the doubt and treat with hormonal therapy. And when you have a ER positive patient with a loss of PR, it's more or less confirm that you're dealing with a slightly more aggressive tumor which may not respond as well to hormonal therapy, and maybe a luminal B type. HER2 is found in almost 15 to 20% of all breast cancers, and then it's ASCO-CAP guidelines have very clearly mentioned how to report HER2, and you define it as positive if there's 10% or more tumor cells which exhibit a strong uniform membrane staining. So this is a membrane stain as compared to the ER, which is a nuclear stain. Ki67 is just a marker of proliferation. This has been a great subject of controversy. The St. Gallen meeting way back in 2011 said low proliferation tumors have a Ki67 less than 14%. Then later they suggested that it was more than 20%, and I think now the committee for Ki67 is going to revise it, and your cutoff point is going to be 25%. But you know, it makes sense that if you have a ER/PR positive tumor with the PR less than 20%, which according to St. Gallen again fits in luminal B, you have a grade 3 tumor, a young patient, a Ki67, you know in your mind is going to be high, maybe 30, even 40%. So you've got to look at the whole picture. You can't just look at Ki67 in an isolated manner. P53 is something we don't normally look at, and we know that mutation of P53 is commonly seen in triple negative tumors, and they are poor prognostic markers. So these are the different molecular subtypes, and you have IHC surrogates for luminal A, luminal B, ERB2 or HER2 enriched, and the basal-like. And then you also have the subtypes of HER2 enriched, which are ER/PR strongly positive or weakly positive, the luminal A or the luminal B hybrids. And we all know that the PAT-CRs are highest in the HER2 enriched non-luminal type, that is the ER/PR negative, and the triple negative types. And we also know that PCR correlates well with event-free and overall survival, especially in the triple negative subtype, and this has been shown in many studies. Molecular assays do serve purposes. They provide information which is quite distinct and different from the ER/PR, HER2 and Ki67, and over and above the clinico-pathological factors. So abroad they are used much more freely and much more widely, but due to cost constraints and due to the fact that we don't get many small tumors which are node negative and which are strongly ER/PR positive, the use perhaps of profiling assays is limited in our country. So you have the Oncotype DX, which is the oldest assay, and it is useful for women with tumors less than 3 centimeters node negative who are ER/PR strongly positive, and you're in a conundrum whether to give the chemotherapy or not, and what is the benefit. So risk scores which have been changed now, they are 1 to 10, 11 to 25, and 25 or more, which is high risk. There is even evidence that within this intermediate group through the TAILOR-X trial that premenopausal women, especially those under 50, will benefit with even with a RS score of between 20 to 25 will benefit from chemotherapy. Other assays are the EndoPredict or the EpiClin, the MammaPrint assay, and the PAM50. So you have a lot of other assays which are also available, which are telling you and giving you more information over and above the clinico-pathological factors. I'm not going to go into the TNM staging in detail, but needless to say, the recent AGCC has incorporated for the first time ER/PR and HER2 into the staging system, where patients with triple positive disease actually behave like tumors which are one stage lower than the actual TNM stage. So it's worth going into, and it's worth looking up. and important to pay attention that not only is the tumor size and the nodal status important, it is also the estrogen, progesterone and HER2 receptor status. Now, when you talk of disclosing information to the patient, you must look at something called as a material risk. This is a risk where a reasonable person in the patient's position would regard as significant, and which by implication might influence a decision in the selection of treatment. So it's very, very important. Although the level of evidence is just 3, the outcome of patients with breast cancer is better if they are treated by a clinician who has access to the full range of treatment options and works in a multidisciplinary setting rather than in a solo approach. And this is the conceptual framework you're looking at. You're looking at the clinical program development, you're looking at staff development, so trained staff is very important, and access to some sort of translational research or molecular services. Of course, psychosocial services cannot be undermined, along with risk management and the organization itself. So this forms the conceptual framework for comprehensive breast cancer care. Treatment planning is also very, very important. It's important to involve the woman in decisions or the family in their decisions, and this is very important to prepare for definitive treatment. Always remember that you must give choices, but don't give so many choices that the patient gets completely confused, and don't try and give choices to a patient who is very perturbed. So it's very important to first reassure the patient, make sure the patient is able to grasp what is going on before you start giving them choices and bombarding them with options of treatment. And there are a lot of features that help us decide the course of treatment. I have evaluated these in detail through the staging, through the biomarkers that we've talked about. And in conclusion, a detailed history clinical exam is paramount. We do find breast cancers due to an abnormal mammogram, but most cancers in this country are palpable tumors. So it's important to remember the value of clinical exam, self-breast exam in the screening of breast cancer. Ultrasound is important to the adjunct of mammography. MRIs can be done in certain cases where it's not delineated well by other imaging modalities, and the clinician should take on the duty of complete disclosure to help the patient in taking informed decisions. Thank you.